Patient HM.
Patient HM.
Patient HM.
The most famous brain in history. How patient HM changed the field of neuroscience.
In an era of minimal medical knowledge about the brain and memory, scientists assumed the entire brain contributed to a human's long and short-term memory. Our knowledge of memory was limited to philosophical writings. In the 1930s, Carl Lashley attempted to discover where memory originated in the brain. He taught rats and monkeys specific tasks and then destroyed parts of their brains to find out if they would still be able to remember. Carl assumed that if the monkeys and rats didn't remember their tasks, then he would have discovered the origin of memory in the brain. However, Carl practically destroyed the entire brain until the animals forgot their task, and people presumed it was biologically impossible to study where memory comes from in the brain. This caused problems during brain surgeries where patients experienced memory loss since important parts of the brain were removed without the knowledge of how this could affect their memory. The frontier of neuroscience was changed forever after a brain surgery led to an outstanding discovery. This is the story of Henry Gustav Malleisen. Born on February 26, 1926 in Manchester, Connecticut, Henry Malleisen, or more widely known as Patient HM, was in a bicycle accident at 7 years old. He endured a laceration in the left suborbital region of his brain and was unconscious for 5 minutes. This, along with his genetics of epilepsy on his father's side, were said to be the main causes of his seizures that would follow his accident a few years later. At 10 years old, Henry experienced his first minor seizure, the start of a series of seizures that would plague him. When Henry was 16, on his way to a trip to the city for his birthday, he experienced his first major seizure, or a grand mal seizure. As he got older, the seizures became more frequent and severe, and he had to quit high school because his classmates were bullying him. 2 years later, he transferred to a different high school and eventually graduated when he was 21. While in school, Henry was a member of the science club and was fond of guns, hunting, and roller skating. He went on to work as a motor winder, but his seizures grew worse and he was physically unable to continue working. With age came desperation for Henry, as he was having 10 minor seizures a day and 1 major seizure per week. Medications weren't enough to stop his seizures, leading Henry to consider a brain operation where he would become Patient HM.
Dr. William Beecher Scoville was in charge of HM surgery. Scoville believed that he could cure HM's epilepsy if he removed the place in the brain where the seizures originated. Since HM had temporal lobe epilepsy, Scoville removed the right and left temporal lobes. Ultimately, around a fist-sized portion of HM's brain was removed, which included areas like the hippocampus and the amygdala. The surgery ended up successfully minimizing HM seizures, but it also had a striking side effect. That side effect was extreme memory deficits. Scientist Brenda Milner was invited to study this memory loss and made several conclusions. To begin, she realized that HM could remember events before the operation very well, meaning his long-term memory was unharmed. HM could also remember things for a short period of time, which is called working memory or scratchpad memory. This is the memory that allows us to remember small things like telephone numbers. However, the problem with HM's memory was when he had to convert new, short-term memories into permanent long-term ones, a process called consolidation. That meant that HM could not form any new memories. It was as if every day he woke up was the same day of his surgery. People would always have to reintroduce themselves to him, and he was also never sure of where he was for a long period of time. Here we've displayed a direct quote from HM talking about his experience, which states, "Right now I'm wondering, have I done or said anything amiss? You see, at this moment everything looks clear to me, but what happened just before? That's what worries me. It's like waking from a dream. I just don't remember." Strangely, however, it was discovered that HM's skill learning or procedural memory was not affected. This kind of memory is unconscious and automatic. Think of it like this. Even if you remember your ballet lesson perfectly, you're not consciously aware of every muscle you're moving while you do a pirouette. You just do it naturally and without thinking. HM was able to retain these kinds of motor skills. For example, he was once tasked to trace a star on a piece of paper by looking at a reflection of the paper in the mirror. Although at first this task is difficult, with enough repetition, anyone can get better and soon trace the star fairly accurately. HM improved every additional time he traced a star, though he could never remember his previous attempts. He thought that every attempt was his first try. This taught scientists that skill learning is a separate and unique type of long-term memory that's not dependent on the hippocampus. HM surgery led to several breakthroughs in neuroscience. The main two that we have discussed are as follows. Number 1, it changed the previous long-standing belief that it was impossible to biologically study memory. That was clearly disproven as the link between the hippocampus and memory were discovered. And number 2, our short-term working memory and our procedural memory, which involves skill learning, does not require the hippocampus, meaning these skills are completely biologically different from our long-term memories. Our memories make up who we are and the entirety of our lives. That's why the study of memory and patient HM are important not just to the field of neuroscience, but to each and every one of us.
While Milner's studies are crucial to neuroscience today, there is an everlasting controversy involving her colleague and former student Suzanne Corkin.
In 2016, Luke Dirich, grandson of William Scoville, HM's surgeon, wrote a New York Times article raising concern about the ethics of Corkin when she studied HM's brain. Dirich had known Corkin since he was a kid, quote-unquote, had met many times before. However, Corkin had long grown distant with Dirich and Dirich's ventures to write a book about patient HM. Corkin denied his many requests to interview her. Corkin eventually gave in when asked about the custody battle that she won over HM's brain after his death. She refused to discuss it. Corkin and a man named Jacopo Anise were considered the antagonists of this conflict over HM's brain, fighting with many prominent scientists over reputable colleges and organizations. Anise found his own laboratory called the Brain Observatory with the simple goal of collecting the world's most useful brains. Corkin was amused by this idea and teamed up with Anise. Eventually, they won the custody battle and Anise was given the brain. Anise launched a publicity stunt called Project HM, where he sliced HM's brain into 2,401 micro-thin slices. A few months later, Corkin asked for parts of HM's brain back and data Anise had made with it. Anise stalled Corkin's request and wrote a paper about his analysis of Henry's brain, and when it was published without Corkin's participation, a meeting was called in New York. After a long dispute over Anise's paper, Corkin was added as a contributing author to his paper, worked together to publish it. Anise wrote about a lesion in HM's brain that could call for a re-examination of HM's data since the lesion wasn't previously taken into account. Corkin erased this point in the paper and claimed it was quote-unquote highly misleading since it had never appeared in MRI scans prior. She claimed the lesion happened after HM's death due to the handling of the brain after HM's death, that she isn't trying to hide evidence. Anise came back with images from MRI scans that gave clear views of the lesion. Anise claimed the lesions were caused by the use of flat brain spatula to lift up HM's frontal lobes in the operation. The argument whether to include this new evidence was solved in a compromise that the lesion would mention but not prominently. When asked about the fight over the brain by Dirich, she responded, "I don't want to talk about it. We have a brain donation form. That says it all." The form she's referring to only stated that she was entitled to control of HM's brain because she had permission from his closest blood living relative, Thomas F. Mooney, and he donated it to her. The issue is that Mooney isn't Henry's closest relative and only became his conservator earlier that year, which was urged by Corkin. HM's actual close living relative, Frank Malaysian, wasn't consulted when HM was being put into conservatorship. Corkin responded to this information by claiming that she wasn't aware of Frank's existence, but previously avoided answering whether Mooney was his actual closest relative. Corkin also destroyed much of HM's data under the claim that it wasn't accurate and therefore not worthy of publication. After Dirich's confrontational interview with Corkin, she died not long after.
This controversy brings light to the ethics of scientific studies that involve experimenting on humans. There is an obvious disparity of power between HM and the people experimenting with him, as Corkin and him met many times, but each time she would reintroduce herself because HM couldn't remember her. HM's disability was manipulated in order to further scientific studies, and he wasn't able to give consent to his whole life being devoted to research. While neuroscience benefited from studies on HM, it came with the sacrifice of HM not being able to live a normal life.